You were the longest serving employee at Barry University. You've been there longer than anyone else who's been there. That's quite an accomplishment. Is that by choice?
That was by choice. When, in the 70s, when we were able to decide whether we wanted to stay in the area that we were, I chose to stay at Barry because I loved math, and also because the school had changed from when I arrived in 1959. So it wasn't like being stuck in the rut, which some people said, because it was changing all the time. While I was there, I had 9 different offices, and I lived probably in as many different places that I was there. So even that was different, yes. And certainly the students were different from when I arrived and when I left.
Tell me about that. Contrast the beginning to when you retired.
Well, in the beginning, we had young women who, as I look back now, seem so mature compared to the ones that I was working with, you know, at the end. And I don't know whether it's because the classes were smaller and we got to know them better. And then in the end, I was working mostly with students who didn't like math and so on. But I enjoyed that as well because I hoped that when I finished with them, they didn't dislike math more. You know, that at least it was, they liked it more, or at least it was the same level of dislike, yeah.
So you started with an all girls, all Catholic, all white students.
Exactly, and the first black student was a mathematician.
I can't remember her name. They've talked
Cassandra Gray, yes. And I don't know if this should be told or not, but the dean asked me if I would mind having this young woman as a major, and I said to her, why? And she turned out to be one of the loveliest young ladies that I ever had. And I'm in touch with her today. Went to a math meeting in Washington, D.C., and she was in Maryland at the time. Had married, had 4 beautiful children, and I stayed there overnight for one night. And mostly, she's from Miami, but had studied in Maryland. And her husband, I think was, maybe she met him there, but anyway, he was working for the government in some capacity. And so I've kept in touch with her, just maybe once a year or twice a year, but she's one of the girls or women that I've really kept in touch with.
And when she did go to Barry, she was the only black
She was. And amazingly, she was part of a group of about 5, young women who really got along very well. And as I remember, one of her friends took her home without telling her parents that she was black, and the parents came to see me to say that they were not prejudiced, and they didn't mind their daughter being involved with her, but they had gotten to know her so well that they were going to go out one evening, and she said to them, be sure you call before you go to see if I can get in. And they were incensed. They said, why? And she said, well, they almost forgot that she was black, She had fit in so beautifully. Mm-hmm.
And then as it then meant, you started having male students?
Right, and we would have had some of them because when Biscayne College was started, we agreed that upper level math, we would not have the same courses.
So you weren't competing?
So we weren't competing, but their students could come to our college at that time, and they could come to us. And we had an exchange of professors at that time too. Two doctors Rolando, a husband and wife team, would come over, and teach a course and then go back. And then I had a young woman who was minoring in accounting because her father wanted her to do that rather than major in math. So she went over to Biscayne regularly to get that minor in accounting. Mm-hmm. All very cordial. And then at some point, you know, we were, I didn't know all the ramifications of it, but in the beginning, any student at Berry could go to Biscayne, and any student there could come to us. But then pretty soon, money came into the picture, and only this many could come there, go there, and this many could come here. And after that, there would have to be some kind of exchange of money. And then, the agreement was broken, or not broken, but dismantled. But many of their students came for our science courses. And see, that was an area that would be expensive to develop. And had a good business school, whereas when they started, I think we just had a 2-year business program.
Now there's a whole college of business.
Yes, and now, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So over the years, do you think all of the changes were good? When you left Berry, did you like where it was at that point of time? Or?
Well, I would have to say yes, because I was happy to see that we were integrated and that we were also working to help students who were underprepared, and then to learn that, you know, as I spoke with other people, that most universities were having the same problems with students coming unprepared. You know, students who had done 4 years of high school math and you wouldn't know it, you know. So in that sense, yes. I think that what I would miss was it seemed to me that in those early days there was a better spirit of community. You know, that you got to know your students, they knew each other. Whereas there was a time when I was teaching a course with, I would say maybe it was calculus, so there weren't too many students. And someone was missing for 2 or 3 days, so I said, does anyone know about so-and-so? And they said, who is she? I said, well, she sits right there, you know, in that seat. And she's been missing for several days. I'm wondering about her. And so that kind of distressed me, that you could be in the same class in a small class with people and not even know who sat next to you. Because I always had, even when my classes were larger, and that was another thing. The classes went from small, and then I had classes as large as 35. Yes, I did. Mm-hmm.
Not very prided itself on
No, well, you know how they balanced it with the very small classes at the upper level. So in a sense, those bigger classes at the lower level kind of saved, I won't say saved the department, but balanced it so that, and then now we're back to smaller classes though, I think, because for instance, the statistics is taught in a room that has only 24 computers. So it can't be bigger than that, yeah.
Do you miss teaching?
Oh, well, I'm tutoring, yeah.
Who are you tutoring? How are you?
Well, we have the Adrian Ray Literacy Center, and there was a young man who was being tutored by someone, and he wanted to come twice, but the person who was tutoring couldn't do it twice, so Sister Carlene asked me if I would do that, and I started with him, and then he began to have some problems in his life, so had to drop out because they have to sign an agreement that they're going to work outside of class. And then the second person was a young woman who had passed everything for the GED but math, and This was the third time she was going to be taking just the math part, thank goodness. But if she didn't pass it before the end of the year, she was going to have to take the whole thing over. She came, I was told she was Hispanic and didn't speak English very well. So another sister who knows Spanish well came with me, and I explained in English and she translated. She came a week before her test, but she knew what she didn't know. So we worked on those two things, and she passed the test. Can you believe it? But for one tutoring session, she said she couldn't come because she had to take her children to Mass for the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, because she was from Mexico. And Sister Carlina, who's in charge, says, well, don't you think it would be better to come to tutoring? She said, no, I really have to take them to Mass. So Sister Ann Liam, who was the person who spoke Spanish, and I said, okay, we'll pray to Our Lady of Guadalupe then to get her through. But I feel that she must have almost been ready to pass. And that little bit of help on the things she didn't know got her over the hump.
If you, so all in all, you would say the changes that occurred at Berry were good. It certainly is now a much more inclusive,
right.
Very diverse
Yes.
student body, quite a contrast from an all-girls Catholic, all-girls school
Yes.
at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And is Berry fulfilling its mission, the Adrian Dominican mission, do you think?
Well, I think they're really trying, so hopefully they're being successful. But how do you measure?
Well, how do you measure that?
Well, that's the thing. How do you measure? You know, you hear about somebody who was in school a number of years ago and what they're doing now and so on, and all the good that they're doing because they're volunteering besides their work, that it's a good thing. Mm-hmm.
It's very clear that in Berry, as I know they are here, looking to the future for the mission, how it's going to proceed without sisters.
Yes.
Is that a bad thing? I mean, are you sort of nostalgic that there's going to come a time in the future? I mean, Sister Linda could very well be the last sister president of Berry University, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Or do you think this is the way it's intended to be?
That's the way I feel, that if that's what happens, because there really aren't many of us at the university right now. Mm-hmm.
Is that a bad thing, or?
Well, in a way, well, it's not a bad thing because there aren't sisters to fulfill the positions, So in that sense, it's good. Mm-hmm.
Should there be sisters? I guess I'm wondering, can a lay leadership take over and imbue the spirit that the sisters have done throughout the years, in the hospitals, at the universities?
Oh, I think so. I think so. Mm-hmm.
And a lay leadership that doesn't even include Catholics?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd hope that
Well, it doesn't have to include Catholics, I should put it that way. I mean,
yes, right.
And you think that will work out?
I do. I think that will work out because I think that's where we're headed. So.
We're not missing anything by not having sisters?
Well, I think you're missing something because I think we hopefully added something to the whole situation, but I mean, that's being unrealistic.
Sister, how was it that you came to choose the Adrian Dominican Order?
Well, when I was ready to go to college, I remember I was sitting in the kitchen and my mother said to me, Molly Mahoney will pay your tuition if you go to Siena Heights. And she said to me, I'd like you to go for a year, and if you don't like it, you don't have to stay. So I came down for a year, and I stayed and stayed and stayed, and here I am, still here. Mm-hmm.
You've sort of come full circle.
Exactly. Hmm.
So you really came because you were going to someone's going to pay your tuition for the first year. You weren't driven to be a nun at that point.
Oh, no, no, no. It was probably in my junior year that I began to think about it, because I admired the sisters so much and what they were doing. And I wanted to teach. I was studying math because I wanted to teach. And at that time, that's mostly what the Adrian Dominicans were doing. So, and I didn't know other sisters. I had an aunt and a cousin who were Franciscans, but was not very much in touch with them. And so it just seemed natural for me to, join the Dominicans.
And since you joined them, what has it brought to you? How did it change your life?
Oh, traveled around the world for one thing. One of the sisters who had been at Siena asked if I would be her companion on a trip, because we had to have companions at that time. And she had been at Barry for several years, and we had become quite good friends. And so, but I didn't know if that was a thing that I should be doing as a sister. So I wrote to the person who was in charge and asked, about it, and she said, "Oh, yes, go ahead." Well, the original purpose of the trip was to go to the Holy Land. And I think that because she had agreed to the trip, her parents took advantage of it, and the trip grew and grew and grew. So we literally went around the world. And we didn't get to the Holy Land, because that was the year the war broke out. And we were in India, and word came that we were going to have to change our itinerary. And someone at dinner that night had just come from the Holy Land, and we happened to talk to him, and he said that would not be a good idea. So we didn't go. But we went to Iraq and Iran instead of our going into the Holy Land. So it turned out to be.
And how old were you at the time you did?
How was I old? I was maybe not quite 40. Mm-hmm.
Going around the world. Yeah. And also, back then too, women, and I know this is the influence of Mother Barry, but women weren't getting PhDs. I mean,
No.
they were, probably weren't even getting masters, and going to college.
Well, they were getting masters for sure, and if it had been up to me, I would have wanted to get a master's degree, but I certainly never would have thought about the PhD. So that's one of the things I was told to do. And I never would have gone to Notre Dame, I'm sure, even if I hadn't entered. And in fact, when I went home for a visit, I met my old math teacher. And so he had heard that I had a PhD, and he said to me, "In education?" And I said, "No, math. Wasn't I your best student?" And I was his best student, especially in geometry, I used to be I'm an early riser, so I was in school at 7:30, and even then I was helping others who, didn't do as well. Then the other big thing that happened to me at Barry, which is part of my being here, being a sister, was being fortunate to be Sister John Karen's companion. It all started with a visit to the Everglades to look for orchids. And the first trip we took in, we were in water up to our waist because there were nubs underneath and you didn't see them and you'd fall in. And when we finished, she had good boots because she had been doing that, in her graduate work. And I was in those rubber boots that little ladies used to have that went up to the knees. So they were full of water, so I could hardly move. And when I got out, I had to lift my leg. And of course, we were in boys' clothes at that time. lift my leg to get the water to run out. But in the end, the person who directed us thought we had done very well.
Well, if I recall correctly, you went with sister to Brazil or South America. I mean, you really traveled.
Mexico.
Mexico for plants, or?
Yeah.
I don't know it well.
Yeah, well, she was trying to discover what trees the orchids grew on. And so her advisor suggested a trip to, excuse me, Oaxaca, Mexico. And so we drove there, 3,000 miles. And we drove almost 3,000 miles while we were there up into the mountains, wherever we thought there were orchids, gathering bark, you know, for her to test when we got back. And then 3,000 miles back. So it was a 9,000 mile trip for us. And I had learned to drive just before I went so I could help her. And I learned on an automatic, and one of the faculty was loaning us her car, and guess what it was? A stick shift. I had a very hard time.
But you did drive.
I did, because she couldn't do all the driving. So there was that trip, which was quite long. Then he also suggested, he had a lot of contacts. Her director went to Nigeria also to do the same thing. And then one of the young men at Berry, who was the artist, Joe Rufo, was interested in orchids. And so her director again had a station in Ecuador. And so over a Christmas break, we went to Ecuador with Joe Rufo. He was going to sketch the orchids, and a couple of students came at that time too. And we lived with him and took a side trip, you know, to Quito. But before we went there to Ecuador, since we were so close to the Galapagos Islands, which is a great place for an ecologist, which is what she was, we visited that. And then because our sisters were in Peru, and that was close, we visited them before we went to Ecuador. And that was the end of our travels for the orchids.
Did you find orchids? Were your travels successful?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. But I forgot to say that we ground the bark to bring it back. And when we got to the border, we got there just before the border had closed, so we had to wait. But they quarantined all the plants that we had collected and investigated the bags of bark that we had, you know.
Did they know you were nuns?
Yeah, well, we said we were, and I think our IDs probably showed that we were, yeah.
But they wanted to make sure you weren't smuggling.
Right, right, oh.
Did you lose the plants? Did you lose any of your work because of that? Or?
Well, she did lose most of the plants, yeah. So I had to change her plant to one that she got locally. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And why orchids, just out of curiosity? I mean, they're beautiful, but that was what interested her, or her advisor? Or?
Oh, that's the thing. Well, she was interested in plants, and so when she went to the University of Miami to get her PhD, since she was a botanist, she worked with Dr. Cal Dodson, I think his name was, and he's the one who's really interested in orchids, yeah. So he got her interested in them, and they're fascinating. You know, you think of the orchid that you use for corsage, but there are thousands of different orchids, different shades, different everything, yeah.
So you, as a math student, must have been fascinated by this side.
Yes, well, actually, I went to Mexico to be her translator because I knew a little Spanish. And I said by the time we finished, the only thing that I could say well was, "Puede ayudarnos, por favor?" Can you help us, please? We had so much car trouble that it was just incredible, yeah. So, and as I look back now on that trip, you know, two women in Mexico, and this was the early 70s, driving out in the mountains, by ourselves, staying overnight in the car a couple times because the trip was quite long, so a couple nights we stayed in the station wagon. And she got under the car to be sure there was no place the snakes could get in, and we never did see a snake, so.
But that could have been dangerous.
Oh, I know it could have. Now when I look back, I think we were quite foolish,
Well, perhaps the advisor, for suggesting these.
Well, it was true. As a matter of fact, in Mexico, the person didn't have a place for us to stay, but had one to recommend. He was quite sure we could stay there, which was a nice little house. And when we went to Nigeria, that person hadn't even looked into where we would stay, but thought that the sisters would keep us. So we went over to the convent, and they had enough space for us. Yeah.
Had you not joined the Adrians, do you think you would have experienced such a...
Well, I don't know, because just before I entered, one of my high school friends and I come from a very small town, and she had a car, and we had gone probably downtown to get a soda or something, and she says to me, "Don't enter the convent," she says, "teach, and then in the summer we'll travel." And I'll bet you anything that I've traveled more than she has, because I've lost touch with her. So.
I bet, I think you're very right. Yes, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Can you explain something to me? Because I only heard about this now. What is it, corporate sponsorship? I'm unfamiliar with that.
Well, it means that we don't own, but we sponsor. That's the best I can do for that.
I thought some sisters perhaps are involved in I don't know what it is.
Well, I don't know. I know that with those we sponsor, like Barry, it's specified that we have to have a number of sisters on the board, so, and I imagine it's the same with Sienna.
I thought and again, I'm not sure, but I thought it was a sister would take a stake in something like, for Sister Pat, it's the environment, and ecology. For someone else, it might be social justice.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar? I mean, I'm maybe not describing it well. I'm just very unfamiliar with it and just heard about it this morning at breakfast.
Well, is that what Barry has, corporate sponsorship, or is it just sponsorship?
I don't know.
Oh,
That's what I was
okay.
asking.
Well,
yeah.
So that's out of my area of expertise.
Is that on my notes?
Roxanne's saying is that basically, Roxanne was describing it that there's a number of policies or dedications that the sisters stand behind, and there's a corporate attachment to that, meaning that any corporate associations would have to...
Right, that we don't invest in any organization unless we're sure that they're following, these principles. Yeah.
And these would be Dominican principles, or something similar to Dominican?
Something similar to that, for sure, yeah.
Is that why I see on all the coffee machines here, it's...
Free trade coffee, mm-hmm. And, oh dear, I can't think of anything else, but I'm sure there is.
What, do you miss Barry?
Well, I would have to say that I do miss teaching, but I know that I couldn't do it anymore. And I don't miss it in the sense of the fact that there was not much community because of the few sisters living there. At the villa when I left, we were only 4 people, and 2 of them were Franciscans. So we did things together, but not much.
That is one thing that I've heard repeatedly in all these interviews with all of the sisters, is that sense of community, that the bonding of women, that instinctively, because they've chosen this path, get along.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's why I was glad to come back here. First of all, I wanted to pray together. And so I do that. And then there are people all over the place, you know, so that there is that sense of community. Everybody was so welcoming that it was not hard for me to adjust. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you're back in in the community.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking about, again, going back to Barry and the changes over the time and, you know, how it started and where it is now. Well, two questions. One, what is your understanding of why Barry became Barry College?
Oh, well, I think that Mother Gerald's brother was in Florida, and they sensed the need for a women's college that was Catholic. And so we started it. Mm-hmm.